The night before Naomi Judd was supposed to walk into the Country Music Hall of Fame, she used a registered handgun to end her life at her home in Tennessee, and her daughter Ashley was the one who found her. That single sentence contains more tragedy than most people can hold in their minds at once, and yet it barely scratches the surface of what had been happening behind closed doors for decades inside one of country music's most privately fractured families. For 33 years, her husband, Larry Strickland, carried secrets that would have destroyed the public image she had spent a lifetime building. He carried them out of love, out of loyalty, and out of a quiet understanding that some truths are too heavy to hand to the world before the world is ready to receive them. 2 years after her death, he finally spoke, and what came out changed everything people thought they knew about Naomi Judd. She was born Diana Ellen Judd in 1946 in Ashland, Kentucky, a small river town where poverty wasn't a temporary condition, but a permanent texture of daily life. Her mother battled mental illness throughout Naomi's childhood, which meant the household ran on instability rather than warmth, on getting through the day rather than building something lasting. Growing up inside that environment taught Naomi one thing above all others, and that was how to survive without expecting comfort. That lesson lodged itself so deeply in her that it never fully released its grip, not during the years of fame, not during the marriages, not during the treatments and hospitalizations that came later. Survival mode was the only mode she truly knew, and it colored every relationship she ever had. By her early 20s, a marriage to Michael Simonella had already collapsed, leaving her alone with 2 daughters named Winona and Ashley. She relocated, found nursing work, took night shifts when that was all that was available, and raised her girls in the gaps between exhaustion and necessity. There wasn't much room in that life for softness or emotional nurturing, and both daughters felt that absence in ways they carried well into adulthood. Ashley Judd wrote about it openly in her memoir, describing the family dynamic as survival mode rather than connection, saying she felt emotionally abandoned not just during the years Naomi was touring, but during the quieter years too. Winona, who stood beside her mother on stage night after night and harmonized with her in front of sold-out crowds across the country, once admitted that they sang together and ate at the same table and still weren't truly close. That invisible wall was always there, even when everything else looked perfect from the outside. Nashville in 1979 is where Larry Strickland entered the story, and the timing mattered because Naomi was still a nurse then, still dreaming rather than arriving. Larry came from gospel music, specifically from years spent with J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet, and before that from the road with Elvis Presley himself, where he sang backup during some of Elvis's most celebrated performances. Quiet and grounded where Naomi ran hot and electric, he balanced her in the way that certain people instinctively balance each other without either of them fully understanding why it works. 10 years of building a life together preceded the wedding, which took place on May 6, 1989, at Christ Church in Nashville. By that point, the Judds were already one of the most decorated acts in country music history, with multiple Grammy Awards, a string of #1 hits, and a public image built around the idea of a mother and daughter who had clawed their way from nothing to everything together. Then 1990 arrived and changed the shape of everything. Naomi's hepatitis C diagnosis came at the absolute peak of the Judds' career, and the illness forced a retirement that no one was ready for, least of all Naomi herself. The farewell tour became an extended act of grief performed in public, It's with audiences weeping openly at every stop, and Winona standing beside her mother, knowing the clock was running down on something irreplaceable. Losing that career wasn't just professionally painful for Naomi. It stripped away the identity she had built from scratch, the one that had given her purpose and connection and proof that all the hard years had meant something. What remained was a woman who had always run toward the next thing, suddenly with nowhere to run, stuck inside a house while Larry continued touring, alone with fears that had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of quiet to fill. The phone call came while Larry was away on one of those tours, and the woman on the other end of the line was a stranger to Naomi. She told Naomi she was in love with Larry Strickland. Yeah, she called him her soulmate and shared details specific enough to feel real and devastating at the same time. Naomi said nothing to Larry that night, or the next morning, or for an entire day after that. She held it inside, which for a woman with her history of abandonment and her hair-trigger fear of being left was an act of compression so intense it could only end one way. When Larry walked through the front door after returning from his tour, he stepped into a scene that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Their wedding photographs had been torn apart. His belongings were scattered across the front lawn, and Naomi was standing there holding a registered handgun, and she pulled the trigger. The bullet missed him. Larry confirmed this in the 2025 Lifetime documentary, The Judd Family: Truth Be Told. Choosing his words carefully and without dramatization, saying only that it really happened and that her action came not from violence but from a pain so old and so accumulated that it had simply run out of anywhere else to go. He never called the police. He never told her daughters or their friends or anyone in the music industry. He packed what he needed, left the house, stayed away for several weeks, and when Naomi eventually reached out with an apology, they made what he later called a silent agreement. For love, for the career, for the children, to bury the incident and keep walking forward together. A 1995 television movie called Naomi and Winona, Love Can Build a Bridge, included a scene that mirrored the real incident closely, but it was framed as fiction at the time, and neither Naomi nor Larry confirmed anything. The public moved on, as the public always does. The secret stayed buried for nearly 3 decades. What followed the reconciliation was not a clean or simple peace. Their marriage continued carrying the weight of that night, in addition to everything else already pressing down on it. Larry admitted that during her worst episodes he sometimes retreated into silence rather than pushing through his own discomfort to reach her, choosing quiet over conflict in ways he later recognized had made things harder for her rather than easier. He has said plainly that if he had understood where she truly was emotionally during those final months, he would have been much softer with her, and that regret sits in him still. Naomi's psychiatric diagnoses accumulated over the years into something that, taken together, was almost incomprehensible in its weight. Severe depression, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and chronic sleep disorders, each one capable of consuming a person on its own, were all operating simultaneously inside her. She entered inpatient psychiatric facilities on multiple occasions, spending stretches of time in round-the-clock care settings where recovery could be the only focus. Electroconvulsive therapy was part of her treatment when medications stopped providing adequate relief. Between 2011 and 2013, Larry described her condition as especially severe, noting that she had become increasingly disoriented and withdrawn, sometimes struggling to recognize familiar faces, sometimes retreating so far inward that the people standing directly in front of her couldn't reach her. Watching that happen to someone you love, someone whose presence had always been so vivid and forceful, was something he described as a particular kind of helplessness with no good name. Video footage from those years showed it plainly to anyone paying attention. The spark that had defined her on every stage she ever stood on was visibly gone, replaced by something distant and hollowed out. Physically, she appeared thinner, her energy depleted in ways that went beyond ordinary tiredness. Emotionally, she seemed to exist just slightly out of reach of everyone around her, present in body but absent in whatever way actually counted. April 2022 brought her final weeks, and they arrived heavy with signs that those close to her couldn't fully interpret in the moment. A sudden private trip to Vienna, Austria, taken alone without Larry, drew quiet concern from those who knew her. Whether the trip was for treatment or rest, or simply a need to be somewhere unfamiliar and unburdened by expectation, nobody has been able to say with certainty. When she returned to Nashville, the people around her noticed she seemed even more exhausted than when she had left, more withdrawn, more unreachable. The Country Music Hall of Fame induction ceremony was days away, a recognition long overdue for her and Winona, and yet the joy that should have been building toward that moment was nowhere in her. She seemed to be running on something far past empty. April 30th, 2022, Ashley Judd found her mother. The induction ceremony was scheduled for the following day, and the family made the decision to go ahead with it, believing it was what Naomi would have wanted. Winona stood on that stage with tears running freely down her face and spoke about love and loss and the complicated, irreducible reality of who her mother had been. Larry stood nearby and said nothing publicly, offering instead the kind of presence that doesn't require words. 33 years of marriage held quietly inside him while the world processed its grief around him. The will that surfaced after her death was written in 2017, and its contents landed hard on everyone who heard them. Naomi had left her entire estate, estimated at around $25 million, entirely to Larry Strickland. Winona and Ashley received nothing. The revelation tore open questions about the family's private dynamics that had long been papered over by the public image of unity and resilience. Voicemails between Naomi and her daughters from her final days became known after her death, raw recordings full of hurt and frustration and love that kept failing to find the right shape to travel through. Journal entries and unsent letters were discovered as well, and in them Naomi wrote about guilt, about longing, about a desire for reconciliation with the daughters she had loved in ways that hadn't always translated into something they could feel and hold on to. Winona responded to the will publicly with a composure that spoke of someone who had already done a great deal of private grieving. She stated clearly that losing her mother was a larger pain than anything involving inheritance, and that her focus was on Naomi's legacy rather than legal questions. Ashley, whose years of honest public writing had already given people a window into the complexity of her relationship with her mother, shared a more layered response, one that held room for love and grief and a continued effort to understand a woman who had often been too consumed by her own suffering to be present in the ways her children needed. Larry Strickland's decision to speak in 2025 came after 2 years of private mourning, and the documentary gave him a structure in which to finally say what had been held back for so long. He confirmed the shooting incident directly and without performance, framing it not as something Naomi had done to him but as something her pain had done to both of them. He spoke about the final months of her life with regret and clarity, wishing he had recognized earlier how severe her depression had become and responded with more gentleness rather than encouragement to eat better and exercise. He spoke about what it means to love someone living with serious mental illness, describing it simply as walking that path with them, which is what he did for 33 years across every kind of terrain that path can run through. Naomi Judd built something extraordinary from conditions that should have made it impossible. A career that filled arenas and stacked Grammy Awards and gave millions of people music they held close for the rest of their lives. Country music history, mental health awareness, the story of American poverty and resilience and the cost of fame, all of it runs through her biography in ways that keep mattering long after her death. And underneath all of it was a woman carrying wounds from childhood that fame and talent and love were never quite enough to heal completely, doing her best inside a life that kept asking more of her than any single person should ever have to give. The people she left behind are still learning how to hold all of that at once, and that, more than any platinum record or Hall of Fame plaque, is probably the truest measure of how fully and how humanly she lived.